The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Where the Hudson River broadens out into what the Dutch sailors called the Tappan Zee, there is along the shore a small market town called Tarrytown. Not far from Tarrytown lies a quiet and mysterious valley surrounded by high hills, where the only sounds you're likely to hear are the murmuring of a brook, the whistle of a bird, or the tapping of a woodpecker. Long ago, this valley was called Sleepy Hollow because it was so quiet and because the Dutch farmers who lived there were sleepy and quiet too. Any night, you might have found them dreaming in front of a fire, telling stories about ghosts and goblins who bewitched that part of the land. Mostly, they talked about the horseman who haunted the valley. He was a soldier whose head had been shot off in the Revolutionary War not many years before. Every night, it was said, he rode through the hollow in search of his head. Throughout the countryside, he was known as the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. To this haunted valley, in those years long ago, there came a young man named Ichabod Crane. The name of Crane suited him well, for he looked very much like that comic bird. He was tall and extremely skinny. From his narrow shoulders stretched long arms, and his hands dangled far out of his sleeves. His feet were as broad as shovels, sticking out on each side of his small head were huge ears. He had large green eyes and a long nose. All in all, his head looked like a weather vane perched on his thin neck, ready to tell you which way the wind might blow. Ichabod became the school teacher for the children of Sleepy Hollow. His schoolhouse stood alone at the foot of a wooded hill. A brook ran close by, and a huge birch tree spread its branches over the doorway. During the day, he listened to the children as they recited their lessons. Every now and then, he interrupted to ask questions or to punish one of the more mischievous children with the birch switch that hung beside his desk. When school was over in the afternoon, Ichabod became more human and friendly. He talked and played with the older boys, and on holidays, he walked home some of the smaller ones who had pretty sisters or mothers who liked to feed him well. He made little money from the school, hardly enough to keep him well fed, for he was a huge eater, and no dinner was too big for him. He also had no home of his own. It was the custom for him to take turns living with the families in the hollow. Every Sunday, he was off to a new home, carrying his belongings tied up in a cotton handkerchief. The good Dutch women welcomed him when he came to stay because, by going from place to place, he came to know all the local gossip, and they thought him very wise because he had read a few books from cover to cover. Also, he knew as much as they did about goblins and witches and other supernatural beings. Indeed, Ichabod was more superstitious than they were. No tale was too wild for him to believe, and he never tired of hearing a new one. He spent many a long winter evening talking to the old Dutch wives as they sat spinning or roasting apples before a fire. He heard about ghosts and goblins, about haunted fields and brooks and houses. Most of all, he heard about the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. How he hated to leave those cozy firesides on Sunday evenings to walk to his home for the next week. The woods at night seemed full of all kinds of ghostly life. Was that a ghost in the shadow of a pine tree? No, it was only a shrub covered with snow. He heard footsteps behind him in the silent night. Was something trailing him? The headless horseman? No, it was only the echo of his own footsteps. Ichabod trembled when a firefly flew across his path, and he was ready to run for it if a beetle brushed his cheek. His only help against the terrors of the night was to sing hymns. In spite of his fear of the haunted hollow, however, he was a happy man. That is, until he met someone far more worrisome to man than a world of ghosts and goblins. A pretty girl. Besides teaching school to all the children of the Hollow, Ichabod also began to teach singing to the older girls. The prettiest of his pupils was Katrina van Tassel. She was the daughter and only child of a prosperous Dutch farmer, famous not only for her beauty, but also because she was an heiress. And she was flirtatious and teasing. Ichabod liked Katrina when he first set eyes on her, but he liked her especially when he called upon her at her home. Old Mynheer Van Tassel, her father, had a snug, cozy farm on the banks of the Hudson. A great elm tree spread its branches over the handsome house. But the huge red barn behind it pleased Ichabod's hungry eyes the most. There he saw rows of pigeons cooing in the sunshine on the roof, round, fat pigs grunting in their pens, and small suckling pigs romped with one another. Snow-white geese floated like a fleet of boats in the nearby pond. Ducks bobbed along behind them, and turkeys paraded through the farmyard. Ichabod's mouth watered as he thought of all the good food this would mean in the wintertime. In his mind's eye, he saw every little pig running around with an apple in its mouth. He saw pigeons on a dining table covered with a flaky crust of pie. The geese were swimming in their own gravy, and the ducks lay in the serving dishes, 2 by 2. Ichabod's long nose twitched as he thought of the fat side of bacon and delicious ham that would come from the sleek old pigs. Then Ichabod rolled his great green eyes over the rich meadows and orchards of apples, peaches, and cherries, and when he went into the house, he lost his heart entirely. Indeed, from the moment Ichabod saw the farm, the house, the fields belonging to Mynheer Van Tassel, his one aim in life was to marry his lovely daughter. To win Katrina, Ichabod set for himself a task harder than that of any knight of old legend. A knight only had to make his way through gates of iron and walls of stone to find his lady, which was done as easily as cutting through apple pie. Ichabod, however, had the strongest and handsomest country boys of the Hollow as rivals for Katrina's hand. The boldest of her suitors was Brom Van Brunt, the hero of the neighborhood. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and his black hair was short and curly. Because of his strength and height, he was known as Brom Bones. He was famous for his horsemanship and always ready for either a fight or a frolic. When old ladies of the Hollow were awakened at night with a shout of whoop whoop halloo, they knew that Brom Bones and his friends were out for a night of fun. If ever a trick was played or there was a fight, one could be sure that Brom Bones was at the bottom of it. For some time now, Brom had been courting Katrina, who neither encouraged nor discouraged him. The sight of Brom's horse in front of her house was enough to send most of her suitors off down the road after other girls, but not Ichabod Crane. Ichabod was neither strong nor clever, but he was persistent. As a singing master, he had every excuse for calling upon Katrina. In the twilight of a summer afternoon, he sat with her on a porch, or walked with her in the meadow, and Katrina laughed and seemed to enjoy his company. As time went on, Brom Bones' horse was seldom tied at the Van Tassel gatepost, and a bitter feud grew up between him and Ichabod. Brom would have liked to fight Ichabod. One day he boasted to a couple of friends, "Someday I'll fold up that school teacher and put him away in one of the schoolhouse shelves." But Ichabod knew that Brom could beat him in any fight, and the schoolteacher was careful not to give him a chance to start one. So Brom began to play tricks on him. One day he smoked out Ichabod's singing school by stopping up the chimney. Another time Ichabod arrived at the schoolhouse to find the benches and desks turned topsy-turvy. He thought that all the goblins of the hollow must be after him. Worst of all, Brom tried to make Ichabod ridiculous in front of Katrina. One evening, Brom rode up to her house with a mangy dog at his heels. It was the hour for Ichabod's singing lesson with Katrina. Brom walked up to the porch, the dog behind him. He commanded the dog to sit down. Then he took off his fur cap and bowed low to Katrina, saying, "Here, Miss Van Tassel, is your new singing teacher." Then he turned to the dog. "Sing, boy," he commanded. And the poor dog, thin and knobbly as Ichabod himself, began to howl. Ichabod thought it best to say nothing. Katrina scolded Brom for being so rude and sent him on his way, but even though she seemed angry, Ichabod could not help feeling that she was also amused. One autumn afternoon, Ichabod sat at his desk in the schoolhouse thinking about Katrina and her father's well-stocked barn. Only the murmur of his pupils reciting lessons broke the stillness. Suddenly, an old man appeared in the road outside. Ichabod, glad of an interruption on his dull afternoon, went to the door to see what the old man wanted. His heart leaped when he heard the old man say, "Miner Van Tassel invites you to come to a party at his house this evening." Ichabod was so happy about the invitation, he could hardly find words to tell the old man that he would be there. And he was far too happy to keep his pupils working any longer that afternoon. He hurried them through their lessons and scarcely noticed when they made mistakes. He let the whole school out an hour before the usual time. He then began to make himself presentable for the evening. He brushed his best and only suit until it almost shone. He combed his hair in front of the broken mirror in the schoolhouse. Then he mounted a horse borrowed from Hans Van Ripper, the farmer with whom he was living that week. This horse was really an old plow horse. It was shaggy and broken down, but it must once have been a spirited horse in its own, for its name was Gunpowder. Ichabod was well suited to his nag. The stirrups were so short that his knees came nearly to the top of the saddle. His elbows stuck out on either side like a grasshopper's. He carried a whip straight up in the air before him. A small cap kept slipping down over his nose, and his black coat fluttered behind him. So he arrived in the fading sunlight of the early fall evening at Katrina Van Tassel's grand party. The house was crowded with farmers and their wives and children dressed in their best. There were pretty girls in ribbons and straw hats and young men in short coats adorned with rows of brass buttons. The object of all eyes was Brom Bones, wearing a new fur cap with a long fox tail. He rode up on his favorite horse, Daredevil, who lived up to its name in every way. But it was not the guests or the pretty girls that made Ichabod smile so broadly. It was the sight of the tables covered with cakes of all kinds, sweet cakes and ginger cakes, shortcakes and honey cakes. There were also crullers and donuts and pies, There were ham and beef dishes and bowls overflowing with fruits. The more food he ate, and the more he saw, the happier Ichabod became. He was a good man and thankful for everything, but he could not help chuckling to himself and thinking that it might all be his one day. Ho ho, he thought, then I can leave the schoolhouse forever. All this will be mine. His eyes sparkled at the thought, and I'll never have to be a school teacher again. Just then Katrina's father clapped his hand on Ichabod's shoulder. Eat up, my boy, he said. Enjoy yourself. The night is yours. Ichabod smiled even more. He felt that these words were a sure sign that he would win Katrina. From a main hall of the house came the sound of music. A gray-haired musician was playing the fiddle. All the young people began to dance. Bold with the happiness of the evening and the good food he had eaten, Ichabod went right up to Katrina, bowed low, and asked, Miss Katrina, will you be my partner in this reel? Oh, Mr. Crane, I should be delighted, she answered, smiling. Brom Bones sat in the corner watching, furious with love and jealousy. Ichabod loved to dance. His loose-jointed figure clattered around the room like a puppet on a string. Katrina flew round and round with him, breathless and laughing. Brom frowned more and more. He tried to think of a plan to get Ichabod out of his way forever. At the end of the dance, Ichabod went out to the porch to join the older people who were gossiping about their favorite subject, the legends and the spirits of Sleepy Hollow. One old man puffed on his pipe and told of the woman dressed in white who haunted the dark woods at Raven Rock. On cold winter nights you can tell when the storm is coming, he said, for just before one, she shrieks enough to wake the dead. The other guests shivered a little and moved closer together. Old Mr. Van Tassel turned the talk to the most terrifying ghost of them all, the headless horseman of Sleepy Hollow. Do you know, he said, he's been seen lately by at least 2 of my neighbors riding around the roads at night. Well, said a farmer, my oldest son saw his horse tethered in an old graveyard night before last. Mark my words, it's there every night. Aye, said another, the graveyard and the old church have had their share of uneasy spirits. It's a wonder anyone dares to pass by there after dark. That it is, rumbled Van Tassel. It's a lonely place and a gloomy one. I hardly like to take that road, even in broad day. At this, one of the old men who did not live in the hollow snorted. You can't make me believe in all this talk of ghosts and headless horsemen, he said. These are stories for old women and children, not for me. Miner Van Tassel turned to his friend. Come, Brower, he said. Tell the old one how you learned to believe in ghosts. Brower smiled shamefacedly and puffed slowly at his pipe. 'Tis true, he said. I never did hold with all that talk until last midsummer night, when I met the horseman myself. The old gentleman raised his eyebrows. It's as true as this pipe full of tobacco, Brower went on. I was coming home late and wondering whether to take the shortcut through the hollow. Just then the horseman rode out of the wood and blocked the path in front of me. Before I could think of what to do, he yanked me onto the saddle behind him, and off we went in a wild gallop that I'll never forget. I was afraid he was going to take me back to the graveyard with him, but before we got there, we stopped at the bridge. What happened then? Asked the doubting old gentleman in spite of himself. Then that devil of a horseman turned into a skeleton before my eyes. I could see the moon shining through his ribs when he leaped off over the trees in the midst of a noise like thunder. Now, friend Brower, broke in Van Tassel, you forgot to mention that he tossed you into the brook like a sack of meal before he left you. That's so, said Brower, who did not like to admit that even a ghost had gotten the better of him. Now what do you think of that, Miner Van Tassel? Asked the old man. But before the old fellow could decide whether he believed the story or not, Brom Bones spoke up. "I can beat that story 3 times over," he boasted. All eyes turned to him. "I was coming home the other night from a party," said Brom, "when I heard the sound of a horse's hoofs behind me. I looked around, and there, sure enough, was the headless horseman. And what do you think I said to him?" Everyone waited breathlessly to hear how the hero of the hollow had dealt with the fearful horseman. "Well," Brom continued, "I couldn't see being afraid of him, so I just made a bet with him that Daredevil could go faster than his horse, and we agreed whoever lost the race would owe the winner a bowl of punch." Ichabod gasped at the boldness of his rival, and his green eyes grew big with horror. "I would have won the bet too," said Brom Bones. Daredevil had his horse beat all hollow. But just as we got to the church bridge, the horseman disappeared in a flash of fire. I tell you, I'd just like to meet him again and get that bowl of punch that's coming to me. "Maybe he'll be waiting for you tonight when you're on your way home," suggested Brower. "Not for me, ho! He knows he can't frighten me," Brom laughed. "Tonight he'll be after someone he can really scare. Someone like Ichabod there." Ichabod laughed nervously and glanced over his shoulder into the black night. No one said anything more. Each man just sat wondering silently what he would do if he ever came face to face with the horseman. On the dark porch, lit only by the occasional flicker of a pipe, anything seemed possible. Gradually, the party broke up. The old farmers guided their families into wagons and rattled off. Some of the girls rode off behind their sweethearts, and their gay laughter echoed into the quiet woodlands. When all the laughter and clattering of hoofs had died away, only Ichabod stayed behind. He stood with Katrina on the porch he admired so much. After such a happy evening, After such a happy evening, it seemed to be the right time to propose to her. He could hardly see her face in the darkness, but he took her hand and knelt down on the stoop on his bony knee. "Katrina," he murmured. "Yes, Mr. Crane," she said. She withdrew her hand, but her voice did not lose its friendliness. "Katrina," he said, clearing his throat. "Katrina, I would like you to be my wife. You have seemed to like me. Could you accept me as a husband?" "Oh, Mr. Crane," she said, laughing softly, "you've mistaken me. I have looked on you as a singing master, and a very pleasant one, but as a husband I fear not." Then she smiled at him and said, "It was kind of you to ask me." In that black moment, all Ichabod's hopes and dreams vanished. He could say nothing. His loss was so overwhelming. He rose slowly and, forgetting his usual gallant good night, stumbled down the steps. Looking neither to the right nor to the left for a farewell glance at the wealth over which he had so often gloated, he went to the stable. Gunpowder was sleeping soundly. Ichabod had to kick him awake. It was midnight when Ichabod, sad and very woebegone, started homeward along the hills he had ridden over so cheerfully that afternoon. The hour was as gloomy as himself. Nothing stirred in the chill night air. Now and then a cricket chirped or a bullfrog spoke from the marsh. All the tales of ghosts and goblins that he had ever heard flooded about poor Ichabod. The night grew darker. The stars seemed to fade away, and clouds occasionally hid them entirely. Ichabod had never felt so lonely and sad. And he was approaching one of the most haunted spots in the hollow. In the center of the road was an old tulip tree. It towered like a giant over all the trees around it. Its gnarled branches twisted down almost to the ground, and then turned to rise into the air again. This tree was a landmark not only for its size, but also for the many strange stories that were told about it. As Ichabod neared this fearful tree, he whistled to keep his spirits up. He thought he heard an answering whistle. He stopped dead. But all was well. It was only a blast of wind blowing sharply through the branches. Suddenly he heard a groan. His teeth chattered and his knees knocked, but it was only the sound of one branch rubbing against another as they swayed in the wind. With a sigh of relief, Ichabod passed the tree, but new dangers lay before him. Not far from the tree, a small brook crossed the road. At the rough log bridge that crossed it, Major Andre, the famous spy, had been captured during the Revolution. Ever since, the brook had been considered haunted. Ichabod's heart began to pound as he approached the brook. He gave old Gunpowder a particularly hard kick in order to hurry him over the bridge. But the obstinate horse ran sideways instead of forward. Again, Ichabod urged him on. Gunpowder dashed into the bushes on the other side of the road. Now Ichabod both kicked and whipped the poor old nag. It plunged forward, but stopped so suddenly at the bridge that Ichabod almost flew over its head. Suddenly Ichabod heard a horse's hoof paw the ground at the other side of the road. He looked around. In the darkness of the woods he saw an even darker shadow. It was huge, black, and shapeless. It made no move, but sat there motionless like some giant monster, ready to spring. Ichabod had never been so frightened. What could he do? It was too late to turn and flee, and anyhow, how could he escape a ghost or a goblin? He decided to be brave and speak. "Who are you?" he stammered. There was no reply. Who are you?" he whispered, trembling. Still there was no answer. Ichabod shut his eyes and tried to sing a hymn to drive away the awful spirit. Just then, the shadowy thing moved into the middle of the road, and now Ichabod saw something of what this strange form looked like. It seemed to be a man of great height sitting upon a powerful black horse. The man, if man he was, spoke no word, but jogged beside Gunpowder, who had now got over his fright. Ichabod kicked Gunpowder, hoping to dash ahead of his new companion. The stranger kept an equal pace. Then Ichabod pulled at the reins, hoping to lag behind. The stranger did the same. Ichabod's heart sank. He tried to keep on with his singing, but his tongue would not move. He was terrified most of all by his eerie companion's mysterious silence. Suddenly he saw the reason for it. As they rode over a slight hill, the rider was outlined against the sky. Ichabod turned to look more closely at him and gasped with horror, for the stranger had no head on his body. What was worse, he carried a head before him on his saddle. Desperate, Ichabod showered his horse with kicks, and Gunpowder finally tore down the road as if all the ghosts on earth were after him. But the ghostly rider still galloped close behind. Away they dashed as stones flew and sparks flashed, and they were headed straight for the old church with its haunted graveyard. For a while it looked as if Gunpowder would outrun the mysterious pursuer, but then Ichabod felt the saddle slip. He tried to hold it on, but in vain. Just before it fell, he grabbed Gunpowder around the neck and held on for dear life. For one instant, Ichabod thought how angry old Van Rippen would be to lose his best saddle. But it was no time for small worries. The goblin was hard on his heels, and he was having a time keeping himself on old Gunpowder's bony back. Suddenly the woods disappeared. Ichabod's heart lifted. The church lay ahead, and with it the bridge where, according to Brom Bones and Brower, the horsemen would disappear. If I can reach that bridge, thought Ichabod, I'm safe. He heard the black horse panting close behind him. He kicked Gunpowder again. They sprang upon the bridge and crossed it. Ichabod looked around to see whether his pursuer would disappear in a flash of fire and clap of thunder. Instead, he saw the ghost standing up in his stirrups and lifting his head from the saddle as if to throw it. Ichabod tried to duck, but he was too late. The horseman's head hit his own with a tremendous crash. He fell headlong in the dust, and Gunpowder, the black horse, and its goblin rider all passed by him like a whirlwind. Early the next day, Hans Van Ripper awoke to find Gunpowder with neither saddle nor rider, nibbling grass at his front gate. Ichabod did not appear for breakfast, nor did he come to dinner. His pupils waited for him at the schoolhouse, but he never came. Hans Van Ripper began to wonder what could have become of his saddle and Ichabod Crane. A search party went to look for them. On the road to the church, they found a saddle covered with dust. They traced the horse's tracks to the bank of the brook. There they found Ichabod's old woolen cap. Beside it lay a shattered pumpkin. They searched the brook, but they discovered no sign of the schoolmaster anywhere. At church the following Sunday, no one talked of anything but Ichabod's disappearance. Everyone decided he must have been carried off by the headless horseman, but no one was able to figure out what Ichabod had been doing with the pumpkin. Shortly after, Brom Bones married Katrina, and they were both very happy. Brom always looked very amused when anyone told the story of Ichabod Crane, and he roared with laughter when the tale reached the part about the pumpkin. A few folk wondered if he knew more about Ichabod's last night in Sleepy Hollow than he chose to tell. Many years later, an old farmer came back from a visit to New York with a story that Ichabod Crane was still alive and had thrived well. But the people of Sleepy Hollow took this for a tall tale. They believed he had been spirited away by the headless horseman. On a quiet summer evening, it was often said you could still hear his voice chanting a hymn through the lovely woods of Sleepy Hollow.